Is it that time of year again? Yes, it's that time of year where you're going to see a lot of misinformation flying around about Easter and Ostara. So here we go with our, little episode on the similarities and differences of Easter and Ostara. So right away, there's one thing we need to make very clear is that these are completely different holidays with different origins, different meanings, and different traditions and celebrations, right? Let's go through it one at a time. Let's start with Easter. So with Easter, as in other Germanic languages, you might notice that they sound a lot like Ostara, right? They sound a lot like it. You've got the English Easter, you've got German Ostern, and honestly, not many more than that. There's probably a couple, but the actual place that a lot of this comes from is that it's coming from the word for Passover in Aramaic, right? So the Hebrew word for Passover is Pesach, and in Aramaic it's more like Pascha, something like that. Do you see where I'm going with this? In Greek, in pretty much any Romance language, and in Albanian, it all takes some derivative of Pascha, or Pesach, or Passover. That's because Easter actually follows more Passover, Jewish Passover, than it does any Ostara or pagan tradition. And just to add insult to injury, if we really want to also look at other things like Slavic languages, there's also a lot of Pascha in Russia and stuff, but in Slovenian, it's Velika Noč, which means big night, which has nothing to do with either of these, to be honest. On the other side of the fence, Ostara is actually just a reconstruction of something that Bede was talking about. So this monk Bede, he was investigating the Anglo-Saxons at the time, their pagan traditions, trying to figure out what they believed, and he discovered that the month around when Easter would fall, they called it something like this. Something like Eastermona, which is something kind of sort of translating basically to like shining month or like dawn month or something like that. And so this guy here made up this entire, what became the basis for a goddess that no one is actually sure even exists. In 2 sentences of this guy's manuscript, we managed to pull a whole ass goddess out of it that probably isn't legit, TBH. The only other place we get any kind of information at all relating to Easter is from the Brothers Grimm. These guys, they're the ones responsible for some of the really grim stories of folklore, right? Things like Snow White and other things. Brothers Grimm had all the kind of more Scully versions, right? The more intense versions of these tales than the ones that Disney put out many decades later. But nonetheless, they had their book Teutonic Mythology, which kind of goes over basically just one of the brothers' really good scholarly guesses as to the etymology of this word, in which he also speculates it has something to do with the dawn and maybe a dawn goddess. Once again, that's not concrete enough for us to actually say that this goddess definitely existed. It's actually in the era of neopagan and modern New Age reconstruction that we get this guy Aidan Kelly, who takes the word Ostara from these kinds of conjectures from these guys and says, yep, spring equinox, done, handled. That's basically just what he says. And one of the things that I think really is the most concerning about this idea that Ostara is actually Easter is how easily it lends itself to white supremacy, right? And in fact, who had a really great 60-second breakdown of this was actually a Hearthwitch recently. But nonetheless, there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there, whether it be lizard people, Atlantis, any of these things that actually have a lot to do with white supremacy, and specifically with anti-Semitism, both of which went hand in hand with Nazism. And for a lot of white nationalists, whether in the time of the Nazis or today, they absolutely do have a big stock in making any Christian holiday have nothing to do with Judaism and everything to do with anything that was native to European people, right? So despite the fact that Easter follows a very similar date scheme as Passover, and that, it follows the last meal of Christ, which is a Passover meal, so on and so forth, these people will do anything to try and convince you that Easter is actually very secretly a ripped-off pagan holiday, when that is not the case at all. And all it really does is erase the fact that Jewish people exist. Which honestly, the fact that Nazis were so interested in occultism apparently is honestly really wild to think about, considering they were supposedly so heavy on Christian values. It's very interesting to see how willing they were to just go off the deep end to justify any of their awful, race science and race politics and subsequent awful consequences for the rest of humanity. But I can already hear the many next questions which I have received, which you will likely receive, which is that, okay, if Easter and Ostara are so different, why do they have the same kind of motifs, right? Why is it that, when we write down the similarities, we find that both Easter and Ostara have things like, bunnies, or chicks, or flowers, or anything springtime related. The aesthetic of these two at this point in time is virtually identical. Why would that be if these have nothing to do with each other? Well, it's because the concept of a spring celebration does not and never has belonged to any one religion. And not only that, but in fact, Easter actually has a lot of its own very Christian associations, but specifically bunnies, chicks, eggs, and so on. For instance, eggs is actually very much part of Christian myth in that, when Jesus died and he came back, it is said that Mary Magdalene went to, I believe, Emperor Tiberius and said, hey, Jesus has come back from the dead. Emperor Tiberius said, that egg here on the table, this egg, it will turn red before I believe that someone rose from the dead magically. And then the egg, as you might guess, turned very deep and vibrant red. And that is why now a lot of people color eggs. Of course, there were many different traditions for decorating eggs before Christian associations came around, right? We had our Ukrainian psanki, we had all these other kinds of really beautiful egg coloring traditions. But this bit of Christian mythos took on a new significance, and it gave Christians a reason to follow similar patterns. So rather than just having, say, these really nicely decorated eggs from Bela Krajina in Slovenia, or the Pisanki of Ukraine, we now have a reason for everyone who celebrates Easter to play around with some colorful dyes and some eggs. Ta-da! Amazing. Another thing actually is specifically with bunnies. There's actually an idea from ancient Greece that suggests that rabbits could kind of, spontaneously reproduce, that they didn't need to actually do anything that any normal animal would to reproduce. They just spawned and copy pasted themselves. So over time, while this is an ancient Greek idea, it did eventually become associated with the Virgin Mary. It was a symbol, right? It was kind of allegorical. It wasn't meant to be literal, but it was just meant to symbolize the fact that, in Christian tradition, Mary is a virgin when she gives birth to Jesus. So the rabbits had that association with virginity and purity and all these other kinds of things because of Mary, and that's how they ended up getting sucked into the Easter mythos. Beyond that, another thing you might be interested to know is that the Easter bunny, right? Because you know that everyone's going to start talking about the Easter bunny, is that the Easter bunny is something that was specifically cropped up around the 16th century in Germany, kind of as a folk figure, as a little bit of local folklore, and that then went to America around the 18th century with German immigrants. So it's definitely not some ancient pagan thing. It actually, considering the span of human history, showed up pretty recently, which is kind of weird to think about, but that's what it is. And of course, with these similarities pretty much starting and ending here, and all of these specifically Christian mythos I've talked about, another thing that very much differentiates these two is the date. Ostara is always on the spring equinox. It's always on the first day of spring because that's the point, right? It's just a day to mark, yep, the start of the new season and, the beginning of fertility, the world's waking up again, yay, hooray, that's great, that's fine. But Easter, it can either show up in March or April because it depends on the full moon. So as far as I'm aware, they actually use the last full moon before the spring equinox to then count out 40 days from that, and that is when, bang, Easter is, right? So that kind of 40 days after the last full moon around the spring equinox that has to do with the Sunday, that's where it goes. So there's a little bit of tricky math involved in actually figuring out when Easter is. That's why this year, Easter is on April 9th. Whereas in other years, it's been as early as March, it's been even later, right? It's been later than April 9th. It all depends on these calculations. And again, it's going off of Passover, right? So this year, Passover is, I believe, the 6th to the 13th of April. And Passover itself is a really important festival in Judaism. It's the festival that signifies, celebrates, and observes how the Hebrews got out of Egypt. That's why it's called Passover. These people are being passed over, right? So that's where they have the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs and all these other things. And it's a very culturally and historically significant holy day, or holy week even, for Jewish people. So you'll notice that around the same time in the spring, all Abrahamic religions kind of have a similar thing going on. In fact, Ramadan is starting up too for Muslim people as well. So it all follows this general idea, and it all comes around the springtime because for Jewish people, that's when they got out of Egypt. For Christian people, it's because Jesus' last meal was a Passover supper, so on and so forth. And it's important also to consider, once again, that Ostara is a neopagan, New Age construction. The word Ostara is not universal to all cultures. All cultures have their own idea of a spring celebration with different names for it. Same thing with Yule, right? Yule has many different names across many different cultures. It can be something like Saturnalia in Rome, Kolyada among the Slavic people. It can be Yule in the Scandinavian countries. Same goes with Ostara. There's no one culture that can really definitively say, yep, we invented the idea of a spring equinox celebration. It just doesn't happen. And obviously when it comes to differences, the biggest difference you're going to find is the reason for celebrating. So we've talked a lot about Ostara being, spring celebration. So with Ostara, right, you've got these certain ideas here: fertility, renewal, the land's awake, we're getting ready to plant now, the last bit of frost is about to pass, we're looking forward to getting everything ready to go in the ground so that we can have all kinds of good food come summer, right? And we're also looking forward to pulling up some things that we're overwintering, maybe carrots, maybe garlic. We're looking forward to getting those first early spring vegetables, right? New potatoes and ramps and all these other leafy greens. We look forward to all of that. When it comes to Easter, we are celebrating the resurrection of Christ. However, similarities and differences all kind of blend together here because the reason is different, but much of the associations with the resurrection of Christ are going to have a lot of the same power as these general springtime motifs. Obviously, just because of the time of year, you're going to have, the land being awake and planting time kind of still lining up. But otherwise, it's very much about rebirth. It's very much about joy after darkness, right? So we have, of course, fertility and renewal and birth. And likewise, we have rebirth, joy after darkness, all these other kinds of concepts that bring us out of a somber period, out of the very last legs of winter, and into the spring. So even though there's a different reason, those different reasons have themes that line up really well. And that's why it made it easier for pagan people to convert, right? They were able to take these same ideas and make very minor adjustments to translate them here into Easter. That's the fun of syncretism. Now, I can't end this video without talking about a little other misinformation that you're going to come across, and that is this. You are continuously going to hear people say that just because Easter and Ishtar sound alike means that Easter is actually just a cop-off of an ancient Sumerian festival to the goddess Ishtar. After all that we've just discussed, I think you can see why this could not be more wrong, and that a lot of people kind of don't know how to anthropology or archaeology, and they just say, well, this looks similar to this, so they must be connected, and that's a really bad mindset to have. That kind of mindset is why we get stupid conspiracies like the Dendera light bulb and the Baghdad battery. just because it looks similar to our modern eye that has all this information available does not mean it is at all related. Not even in the least. We know now that Easter is really only called some version of Easter or Ostern in certain Germanic languages which have had nothing to do with Sumeria, and beyond that, that the actual holiday itself has a lot more to do with Judaism than any Sumerian pagan religion at all in any sense. Oh my god, I don't know why people insist on doing this, I really don't. But as Christian witches, let me give you guys some really good news. You can observe both of these holidays and their significances. Why? Because once again, the spring equinox is not copyrighted to any one culture. And beyond that, actually, especially in Catholic tradition, old school Catholic tradition, there was a sense of celebrating each season's turn with something called Ember Days. Ember Days are 3 days of very Lenten-like fasting, right? So on any given Ember Days in the start of a season, you would have the Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday to fast. On Friday, you're abstaining from meat, but on Wednesday and Saturday, you just can't have meat outside of your one main meal. And the point is, unlike Lent, where you're kind of like sad fasting, Ember Days are about taking that time to kind of, you know, purify a little bit, show a little bit of penitence, but also to be joyful in your fasting, right? To use it as an opportunity to get more in tune with God by disconnecting a little bit from the material realm. There are a lot of religions where fasting as a concept is meant to disconnect you from your body and get you a little bit easily connected to the spiritual world. So you can pray better, you can divin better, and all those other kinds of things. Springtime Ember Days have already passed. They were actually like, I think the week after Ash Wednesday and Lent and all that even started. But nonetheless, you know, they do come up. They come up in June and, you know, around Pentecost, all those kinds of things. You can look them up pretty easily. And they are another way to observe the change of season. And of course, nothing is stopping you from just saying on the spring equinox, I'm going to have a little bit of a feast for, you know, the first day of spring, so on and so forth, right? Like, nothing's stopping you from doing that either. I personally, I find it a little bit intensive to always celebrate certain holidays, so I don't do that. What I do instead is just take everything Ostara represents with the springtime, and I just wrap it up into Easter. So while we're celebrating Jesus' resurrection, we're also celebrating springtime and flowers and nature and all these other kinds of things too, because the themes, they line up enough that you can do that, and that's a little bit of the point, right? But overall, in the end, that is our general discussion on Easter versus Ostara. So I hope that helps, you know, kind of explain a little bit more of the origins of these things and why they look so similar and where a lot of these things are actually coming from. And so that way, when you see people online saying that Christians stole Ostara, you can tell very patently that they just simply have not done a deeper dive into the research. So with that, I will see you guys next week for our Archangel of the Month, and I hope you have a great weekend. See ya! By the way, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks earlier, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you not only get all these videos, but also recipe cards, specific deity profiles, and lots of other interesting things to look at. Video tiers start at $10 a month, so definitely consider checking it out.